This also illustrates the gastrocnemius head, the head of the calf muscle, and the very long, straight Achilles tendon. Now the Achilles tendon, this arrangement with
Please support this channel by subscribing and leaving comments.
here is trying to calm him down by grooming him. Here we have another one where the alpha male is bluff charging the subordinate. He's reacting with a penile display. Is there anything reminiscent in that image from what you've seen? I mean, you tell me. You know, given all the reactions I've gotten to the suggestion that it's a penis, look at that and tell me that that's not a... All right. Now we come to and this one is really difficult to interpret, but I want to show it because it brings us to the footprints, or to the foot anatomy. Here are the images up here. What I've done here is just inserted a outline. This is the shot just before it steps behind the redwood tree. All you can see here, here's the burl on the redwood with the headlight hitting it and going just over it, okay, shining just over it, and then hitting the leg of the creature or subject right at behind the knee. We've got the thigh, the knee here. Here's the curve of the calf musculature, and then this little faint highlight right here is the very broad heel. Now there was a big rock that it stepped next to, and that's what I was looking for when I was on the scene. I didn't even think about the stick situated there. But in any case, the feature that I want to draw your attention to are two things. First of all, the outline, the profile of the calf. It's very smooth and tapery, or not tapered, I should say. Very smooth and extending all the way down to the heel, as opposed to having a very prominent head of the gastrocnemius and then a long, straight Achilles tendon tapering down to a narrow heel. Now here, as the heel starts to come off, which is this area right here, it's a little distorted because there's debris stuck to the bottom of the foot, but you can see the heel come up, and notice the very sharp angle and very short aspect, relatively short aspect. We're not seeing the entire undersurface of the foot, we're seeing just the undersurface of the heel. The heel's coming off while the midfoot and forefoot are still in contact with the ground. And that continues on, and then the foot lifts off and is solid forward. All right, a quick anatomy primer here. Here are the feet, or the bones of the foot skeleton. The joint that I'm going to be talking about is this, mostly, is right across here. This is known as the transverse tarsal joint. It's situated between the heel bone, or calcaneus, and the cuboid, and also between the ankle bone, or talus, and the navicular. All right, and then we have the other cuneiforms that contribute to the tarsals themselves, and then we have the bones of the instep, which are the metatarsals, and then the actual toe bones, which are called phalanges. All right, here's just an inferior view again. Here's the transverse tarsal joint right across here, not to be confused with the tarsal metatarsal. Right, excuse me, yeah, all right, I got it. Transverse tarsal joint, not to be confused with the tarsal metatarsal joint. Now, the human foot is equipped with a permanent longitudinal arch. Okay? That is just, it's locked in that position by the configurations of the joints and the tie mechanisms on the undersurface of the foot. The plantar ligaments and a very long plantar aponeurosis is kind of like a bowstring down here, which serves to raise the arch and bring it into a more rigid position as the toes are dorsiflexed. It's what we call a windlass mechanism. If you think about some clasps on, say, a luggage strap on a the top of a car, and you grab hold of that handle and you winch it down to pull it tight as it wraps around the drum of the latch. Well, that plantar aponeurosis is attached to the heel bone and then up here to the heads of the metatarsals, but more importantly to the bases of the phalanges. So as the toes are dorsiflexed during toe off, in other words, more accurately, when the foot is raised up like this, that winches that ligament around drum of the head of the metatarsals, shortens this distance, and raises the arch up even higher, and makes it rigid, so that the whole foot is just like this thick. So the foot acts as a lever, so that the calf muscles pulling up on the heel have a rigid lever to act through and amplify the force that's being generated. The 8th foot is very different. Where are all these gaps? No, it didn't drop. Well, it's in there, but it's not open and baffle when it drops in on that one. Okay, well, I'm going to skip it. Well, okay, let me, okay, sorry for that. We'll just skip that. The 8th foot is very different in that it lacks this permanent longitudinal arch. The foot is flat, and it has extreme mobility through the transverse tarsal joint, such that the calcaneus can bend upward relative to the forefoot, unlike a human foot, which remains rigid. So the functional lever of the chimpanzee and gorilla foot is just the length of the calcaneus. Right? And that's an important adaptation if you have to hold on to a branch as you're levering up on the calcaneus. You don't want to disturb that grip or you fall. All right, so this provides some extra mobility. As a consequence of that, when a chimp walks on the ground, their gait is a little bit different. They have what's called a mid-tarsal break during the stance phase. Whereas in a human, when the heel comes off the ground, the entire foot, length of the foot, clear up to the metatarsal heads, the whole arch rises up off the ground. In a chimp, just the heel, just the calcaneus. So the cuboid is still resting on the ground right here. Okay, this is what we saw in the video. Now the only time you have that kind of dynamic in a human foot is in a pathologically flat foot, a flexible flat foot we call it, it has planus. And in that case there is such a change in the tarsals, very frequently these individuals have what's called a vertical talus, the talus, because as the arch drops, the talus drops way down where it's pointed up, almost straight up and down. And it's a very debilitating condition. Okay, and now here's an example again from Harry and the Hendersons, to illustrate two of these points. First of all, when he levers up, we see a straight, well, we see the entire foot from the calcaneus down to the metatarsal heads is raising off the ground. This also shows the artificially elongated toes of the fake foot bending way up, curving way up like this, showing that there's nothing in them, there's empty toes, costume toes. This also illustrates the gastrocnemius head, the head of the calf muscle, and the very long, straight Achilles tendon. Now the Achilles tendon, this arrangement with short muscle fibers and a long, very thick rubber band, essentially, in the form of an Achilles tendon, is an adaptation for elastic storage. And to drive that mechanism, in other words, the tendon can actually store kinetic energy and return it back to the foot as it's during locomotion. But to drive that, you have to have a long, rigid lever. Okay? The short muscle fibers that have a short excursion tighten that Achilles tendon, and then it stores the kinetic energy. So when we compare the calf of a chimpanzee to that of a human, we get two very different appearances. Here we have the gastrocnemius head up proximally located, a long tapering, very straight Achilles tendon, whereas a chimp and a gorilla will have a very short, very broad Achilles tendon. It's not a very good functional elastic storage mechanism, but a long end of the gastrocnemius with long muscle fibers, so that you can increase the excursion at that joint, or the range of motion. Okay, just another view showing the difference in appearance. The very tapering, and on Harry, notice if you watch Harry, you'll see that even though they've artificially broadened his heel, the Achilles tendon still tapers down and is visible through his costume, as opposed to this much more simian appearance. All right, and here you see that, a good example of the penal display and the very simian calf, the shape of the calf, which is very reminiscent of the shape of the calf of the subject on the Redwood video. Okay, here's another one of Harry. You can see the very balled up proximal gastrocnemius and the very straight Achilles tendon. And notice again the position of the foot, way up on the metatarsal heads as he's striding off. All right, now let's take this then a little further. How far can we generalize this kind of anatomy? Well, if we look at the Patterson tracks, here's one of those famous tracks that Mr. Lyle Laverty took one day after the Patterson film was made. And this is a really informative track because of this pressure ridge that's pushed up right behind the mid-tarsal joint. In this case, what we've got is as the heel comes off, flexing at the mid-tarsal joint, the transverse tarsal joint. In this instance, because of the propulsive force that was imposed, a ridge of sand was essentially pushed back into a hump. And as it did so, since there was no resistance above, as it expanded up, it cracked. So it has these longitudinal cracks across it. And these were preserved when Bob Titmus, boy, this projector's thinking, I like my slide. This was preserved when Bob Titmus came to the site and cast this footprint right here. We can see not only the ridge, but the longitudinal cracks here. Now this same kind of pressure ridge is really visible. I hope you noticed this the other night. It's visible on all of these footprints that Bob cast. The two that Patterson cast don't show it very well. He intentionally picked out the cleanest, flattest tracks that he could select from that track site. Here's a side view to show just a little more dramatically how here's the one that Patterson cast, and here's one that Titmus cast. And you can see this ridge here. Now, once again, this is the midfoot and forefoot. This corresponds to the transverse tarsal joint. So as that was raised, the heel was raised up, the ridge was pushed up back behind there. Now, what's interesting though is the relative proportions, the position of that ridge, relative or by comparison to position in the human foot. And we're going to come back to that sort of in an indirect route. Now here are the famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, Bosberg tracks that were discovered initially by Ivan Marks and were examined by Rene and others. This has been a very intriguing track because of the deformity of the right foot. Not only is there this convexity here laterally of the foot, there's obviously some derangement of the joints or some deformity of the joints of the toes. There's also these protuberances on the side, which have been interpreted as either callosities or fibrous masses. They could be any of a number of things. They could be bunions that have formed around the deranged joints here in the calcaneocuboid joint or the cubo-metatarsal joint. They could be gout. There's any number of conditions that might explain that. The deformity of the forefoot, I've been looking into this because it was initially described as a club foot or talipes equinovarus. But in a club foot, the foot is rotated under so that the weight is resting way over on the lateral side of the foot. And that we don't see here. Grover wrestled with that and decided that over time, due to the great weight of this individual, it was simply forced back down to a flat arrangement. There is, however, an even more common condition known as skew foot. Rather than club foot, it's called skew foot, or a milder condition is metatarsus adductus. And we see that right here. In this case, the forepart of the foot is bent inward quite dramatically. And the lateral side is bent, and frequently the joints here are deranged or deformed. Now, I found it really difficult to find any examples of adults that suffer from this condition because it's an easily correctable condition in infants when it's identified. In about 80% of the cases, it simply spontaneously corrects itself with growth, with maturity of the individual. In other cases, it's very readily corrected by applying casts to the foot. But here, let me just show you a couple of examples. Here's one. You can see the bending of the foot over here. And it's very easy to envision that if that condition persisted into adulthood, that the problems that ensue, individuals that suffer from this, tend to ride their weight along the lateral side of the foot. The foot isn't inverted, but still the weight tends to be concentrated on that side, and it imposes stresses on the joints that causes foot pain. And over time, one can easily imagine that these joints would eventually develop arthritis or some other condition that would cause those large bulbous protrusions. Now, Krantz looked at this and saw here an opportunity to infer some of the skeletal anatomy, which he did in this figure, and contrasted it to a human simply enlarged up to comparable length. But what's intriguing is that if in fact, and I say if in fact because we're not exactly sure what this is, and I've yet to talk to some orthopedists and try to find some cases of adults in which this condition has persisted in adulthood. But if in fact this corresponds to the calcaneal-cuboid joint, it suggests that the heel bone is extremely elongated. Now that makes sense given the mid-tarsal break that we talked about, because if you don't have if you don't have this much of a lever, you only have this much of a lever, you can increase the leverage of the heel bone by increasing its length. So this would account for the rather long and very broad heel that we see in many Sasquatch footprints. So it's located way up here. It's about 42% of the length of the entire foot, whereas in humans, it's just a little over 30% of the whole length of the foot. Okay, Grover then went on to fill in the rest here, and he wrestled with the double ball feature. We saw numerous examples of that last night, the split ball or double ball feature. And he decided that the double ball was caused because the metatarsal of the big toe, since it wasn't arched, both the distal and the proximal end of the metatarsal would be in contact with the ground. Our ball is formed at the metatarsal phalangeal joint of the big toe. Okay, if you have both ends of the joint or of the bone in contact with the ground, he reasoned, you would have another ball formed back there. The problem is when you transpose that onto the Bosberg tract, it just doesn't work. He doesn't have them lined up here very well to begin with. In order to bring this all the way up to here, where it really should be, you have to elongate these tarsal elements just ridiculously. They're already too long. But he was working under the assumption that a creature as large as Bigfoot would have to have very, very short toes. In human evolution, the reason we don't look like a chimpanzee with long curved toes is because long curved toes do not resist, like this, do not resist bending stresses in this fashion very readily. Okay, they can't tolerate this kind of force when we're toeing off. And we have a striding gait where we really stride out, so that when we come to the end of the stance phase of our support leg, all our weight is resting right up on our toes. And we push off even before the lead foot heel strikes the ground. All right. Well, he was arguing then that Bigfoot, being even bigger with greater weight, greater mass, would reduce those bending stresses by making the toes even shorter. So he said then this first half of the double ball has to correspond to our ball, okay, making the toes very, very short. Well, this was interesting because first of all, it didn't fit. When you look over here, clearly this is all toe, all the way down to here. Okay, over here, he's calling this the ball, but this is toe all the way down. That corresponds to this all the way down. So I thought, well, what's going on? Well, then, it's just showing the relative position. Now these percentages correspond to the center of gravity, not to the transverse tarsal joint, which would be right here. So if you add on with more, 30% in humans, 42% in the model for Sasquatch. Okay, enter Paul Freeman. And I was going to ask Renee to bring this cast back in. But if Bigfoot has short toes to resist those bending stresses, how do you account for something like this? And other footprints, not just the ones from wall to wall, but occasionally you see other footprints with very long, very splayed out toes, or toes that are going out at really wide angles sometimes. Well, then Paul let me borrow this footprint. And I also borrowed this one from Wes Summerlin. And as best I can determine, under the circumstances, and that's all I can give you, as best I can determine, and I tried to be as crafty and clever as I could in the ways I asked it, neither one of them was aware of these particular casts. And they were made under totally different circumstances. This one cast by Wes Summerlin, and the other by Paul Freeman. Totally different circumstances, separated by space and time by at least, and I don't have as sharp a memory for dates as Danny does, but it was at least 6 to 8 months difference. But as I got back out to the car after looking at these two footprints, I thought, it occurred to me, these are the same foot. Look at this again. Now look at this. The only difference is, in this one, the toes are splayed out, and not only are they splayed out, but you notice these long flat areas? They're artificially, they have an artificially long appearance. The toes have actually dug in and slid a little bit, and so this flat area, and the reason I say that is because you can conceivably get a flat area like that if a toe, a second through fifth toe, is hammered like that. But you cannot do that if you hammer your big toe, which has only 2 bones in it. If you hammer it, all you get is the very tip of it sticking in, not a big flat area like that. So some of that has to be accounted for by curving back and sliding in as the track sort of slipped, the foot sort of slipped back in the impression, giving the appearance of longer toes than are actually on the foot. Likewise, that might explain this little ridge of dirt pushed up back here. If there was a little bit of slippage and the dirt gave enough to hump up a little ridge back here, not like the furrow that we saw on the associated with the mid-tarsal braid, but just a hump up underneath the heels that started to come off. Well, I overlaid these, and if you, and this is a tracing of those 2 footprints. Now, in my estimation, they are made by the same foot. They correspond in width across the metatarsal heads. The toes are the same. If you hear this little light line right here corresponds to the most proximal margin of the flat area, the drag area. If you eliminate the initial impact area, then these shorter toes match up with these apparently longer toes quite nicely. And the toe here on the gripped in one is a little bit shorter, just as you would expect, because it's grabbed in like that. Well, the reason I'm going through this is, at this point, this stage, is that this feature right here, when I looked at that, that looked an awful lot like that first ball on the Bosberg track. And when you hold them up next to each other, they're extremely similar. Well, if that's the case, this is clearly not a ball. It's just a pad on the shaft of the big toe. And the ball is right back here. In fact, this is It almost looks like a double ball here. It really isn't. It's just a dark area like this dark area over here. A piece of bark right there that gives the impression. This is very smooth along here. But the ball is actually right in here. And so I set out to look at this more closely and see if you could conceivably reconstruct a foot skeleton to fit this track. And so I started out with the ankle bone, or with the heel bone and the ankle bone, and I placed them at about the 42% mark here. Okay, so we start out with there, and then we've got to fit in what's left. So we put in the rest of the tarsals, we put in the metatarsals, line up the head of the first metatarsal here with the ball indicated there, and then here's the first phalanx, second, the proximal distal phalanges of the big toe, and they fit in just fine. Now with the heads and metatarsals back here and the toes longer, then you can have tracks that sometimes spread way out, especially if the interdigital webbing is minimal.
If you're enjoying all this rare and unique content, please show your support by subscribing and leaving comments.